On the morning of April 3rd, 1865, the army that finally destroyed Richmond, Virginia, was the one that had spent 4 years defending it. Confederate soldiers, acting on orders from their own commanding general, had set fire to the tobacco warehouses along the riverfront sometime after midnight. The wind caught the flames and drove them block by block up through the commercial heart of the city. The banks, the brokerages, the hotels, the flour mills, the newspaper offices, the restaurants and law offices and jewelers and barber shops, until more than 800 buildings were gone, some 35 blocks of the most valuable real estate in the South reduced to chimneys and rubble. The property loss ran somewhere between $8 and $10 million in a city that had not a dollar of insurance left to recover. Not a cent of it was done by the Union Army camped a few miles to the east. Every bit of it was done by Richmond to itself. That fact, that the capital of the Confederacy was not conquered but self-immolated, is the fact that organizes everything else about Richmond's story. Because this was not some minor river town that got caught up in the war. By 1860, Richmond was the most industrialized city in the American South, ranked 13th in the nation in manufacturing output, a place where real money was made, where serious infrastructure had been built, where fortunes in tobacco and flour and iron were created over 120 years of work. What burned that night wasn't a symbol, it was an economy. And the people who lit the match were the same people that economy had made possible. The story starts, the way it always does in Virginia, with the river. The James runs southeast out of the Blue Ridge and crosses roughly 100 miles of Piedmont before it hits the fall line, a stretch of rapids and rocky drops where the soft coastal plain meets the harder rock underneath. This is the farthest point that ocean-going ships can reach. Anything moving downstream hits deep water here. Anything moving upstream hits rapids, which means that if you're in the business of shipping tobacco or flour to the coast, this is where you build your warehouse. If you're in the business of milling, this is where the river gives you the power to grind. William Byrd II understood all of this when he platted a town at the Falls in 1737. He'd inherited thousands of acres along the James from his father, and he laid out his little settlement the way you'd lay out a commercial venture, because that's what it was. He named it Richmond, supposedly because the view from the bluffs reminded him of the vista from Richmond Hill along the Thames in England. Whether it actually looked anything like Surrey, or whether Byrd was just a man who knew the value of a good name, is anybody's guess. The name stuck, and so did the town. For its first few decades, Richmond was small, a courthouse, a trading post, a place where tobacco planters from the surrounding countryside did their business. But the fall line kept doing its work, drawing enterprise the way gravity draws water. And in 1780, the Virginia legislature moved the state capital from Williamsburg to Richmond, partly because Williamsburg was too exposed to British naval attack during the Revolution, partly because the center of Virginia's population was shifting west. Thomas Jefferson, who was governor at the time and had opinions about practically everything, took a personal hand in the design of the new Capitol building. He modeled it on the Maison Carrée, a Roman temple in Nîmes, France, that he'd admired while living in Europe. It was the first public building in America designed in the neoclassical style, a stone temple to democratic self-governance, white and columned, set on a hill above the James, visible from almost anywhere in the young city. 85 years later, from the steps of that same building, a person standing in the smoke could look out over the ruins of everything Richmond had built and see nothing but chimneys. But that's getting ahead of the story. In the early 1800s, Richmond was becoming something rare in the South, a genuine industrial city. The James River didn't just move goods, it generated power, and Richmond's entrepreneurs used every drop of it. The Gallego Milling Company built a massive flour milling complex at the canal's turning basin. By 1849, the operation ran a 9-story mill with 31 pairs of grinding stones and 6 water wheels. By 1860, the Gallego Works had expanded to a 12-story facility, the largest flour mill in the world. Not the largest in Virginia, not the largest in the South, the world. It shipped barrels of flour to South America, to Europe, to New York, and it had an international reputation for quality because the flour held up during long sea voyages. Just downstream, the Haxall and Crenshaw families operated another enormous milling operation. Between the two of them, Richmond's mills could grind more than 400,000 barrels of flour a year, and the money that flowed through the milling district attracted banks, insurance companies, and commission merchants the way a mill wheel attracts water. But flour, as lucrative as it was, wasn't the thing that gave Richmond its identity. Tobacco was. Virginia had been growing tobacco since the Jamestown colony, and by the mid-1800s, Richmond had become the tobacco capital of the Western Hemisphere. The city's tobacco factories, there were around 50 of them by 1860, didn't just cure and pack raw leaf. They manufactured chewing tobacco and smoking tobacco, pressed it into plugs, flavored it, branded it, boxed it, and shipped it everywhere. Each factory employed dozens to hundreds of workers, many of them enslaved people who were hired out by their owners to work in the stemming houses and pressing rooms. The tobacco warehouses lined the streets near the riverfront and the canal basin. Brick and wooden buildings packed together tightly, block after block, full of dried leaf worth a fortune by the bale. On a warm day, the whole lower part of the city carried the heavy, sweet scent of curing tobacco. That smell was the smell of the city's largest industry, and it saturated everything: the walls, the clothing, the streets, the air itself. Remember those warehouses. Remember how close together they stood, how full of dry, combustible leaf, how deep into the commercial district they reached. That geography matters later. There was another industry in Richmond, one that generated enormous revenue and that most accounts of the city's economy tend to handle delicately. Richmond was the largest slave-trading center in the Upper South. Shockoe Bottom, the low-lying district near the river and the canal basin, concentrated auction houses, holding jails, and traders' offices along a stretch that locals called Wall Street, though the commodity being traded was human beings. After the federal ban on the transatlantic slave trade in 1808, the domestic trade intensified, and Richmond became the central clearinghouse for the sale of enslaved people from Virginia and Maryland to the cotton states of the Deep South. The commissions, the transport fees, the ancillary businesses, the boarding houses, the notaries who processed the paperwork, all fed into the city's economy in ways that the ledger books recorded with precision and that the broader culture preferred not to examine too closely. It was, in dollar terms, one of the most lucrative commercial activities in the city, and it was woven into the industrial economy as well. The enslaved workers in the tobacco factories, the iron works, and the flour mills were frequently hired out through exactly these networks. The money didn't sit in a separate account. It circulated through everything. And then there was iron. The Tredegar Iron Works, sprawling along the James River Canal just west of downtown, was the industrial crown jewel not only of Richmond, but of the entire South. Workers from the famous Tredegar Iron Works in Wales had come to Richmond in 1837 to help establish the operation. And under the management of Joseph Reed Anderson, a West Point graduate who'd left the Army because he could make more money in manufacturing, Tredegar grew into one of the largest iron producers in the country. By 1860, it covered more than 20 acres, employed some 900 workers, and produced railroad rails, locomotive engines, rolled iron, cables, and artillery. It was the third largest iron manufacturer in the United States. Anderson was a practical man who understood that the South's future depended on industry as well as agriculture, and he built Tredegar into proof of what Southern manufacturing could achieve. By 1860, all of this converged into a city of nearly 38,000 people, the 25th largest in the nation, connected to the outside world by 5 railroads and the James River and Kanawha Canal, which George Washington himself had championed decades earlier as a route to carry coal, iron, timber, and grain from the interior to Richmond for processing and export. By the time it was completed in 1851, stretching 197 miles westward, the railroads were already beginning to eclipse it. But for a generation it was Richmond's main artery, and the industries along its banks depended on its water for both transport and power. The Richmond, Fredericksburg, and Potomac ran north. The Virginia Central ran west toward the Shenandoah. The Richmond and Danville ran southwest. The Richmond and Petersburg ran south. The Richmond and York River ran east. Every one of those lines fed goods, people, and capital into the city. Richmond had banks, hotels, the Exchange Hotel, the Spotswood Hotel, theaters, newspapers, churches. It had a commercial district so dense and so tightly built that fire was a known hazard. Everyone carried insurance and hoped for the best. It was a genuine American city, prosperous and productive, with an economy diversified enough that no single shock should have been able to bring it down. And then the Confederacy came shopping for a capital. The original Confederate seat of government was Montgomery, Alabama, but Montgomery was small, remote, and lacked the infrastructure to run a national government in wartime. Richmond had everything Montgomery didn't: factories, railroads, banks, a deep labor force, and symbolic gravity. This was the capital of Virginia, the oldest, largest, and most prestigious of the southern states. When Virginia seceded in April 1861, the Confederate Congress voted to relocate the capital to Richmond the following month. Jefferson Davis arrived to cheering crowds in late May, and the transformation was immediate. The population exploded. Soldiers, government clerks, military contractors, speculators, refugees, camp followers, they poured in from every direction. By conservative estimates, the city's population more than doubled during the war, pushing past 100,000 people crammed into a place built for fewer than 40,000. Housing became scarce overnight. Rents tripled. Prices for everything followed. The Confederate government commandeered buildings across the city. The old Customs House on Main Street became the Confederate Treasury. The Mechanics Institute became the War Department. The Spotswood Hotel, on the corner of Main and 8th, became the unofficial social headquarters for Confederate officers and politicians. Its bar and dining rooms, the most politically important rooms between Richmond and the battlefield. Private homes were converted to hospitals. Churches doubled as meeting halls. A city built for commerce was being repurposed for war, and the seams showed almost immediately. Richmond had become overnight the one thing it could never stop being for the next 4 years: a target. The entire strategic logic of the Union's Eastern campaign came down to a single imperative: take Richmond. Not just because it was the Confederate capital, though the symbolic value was real, but because its industry was genuinely irreplaceable. Tredegar alone produced roughly half the artillery used by the entire Confederacy over the course of the war, around 10,000 pieces by some estimates. Tredegar cast the 723 tons of iron armor plate that covered the CSS Virginia, the ironclad that fought the first battle between armored warships at Hampton Roads in 1862. The city's tobacco revenues helped finance Confederate bonds. Its flour mills fed Confederate armies. If you destroyed Richmond, you didn't just capture a flag. You cut the manufacturing base that kept the rebellion in the field. The Confederates understood this calculus perfectly, and they fortified accordingly. Earthworks, trenches, and batteries ringed the city for miles. The approaches from the east and south were defended in depth. For 4 years, Union armies tried to reach Richmond and couldn't. Not in the Peninsula Campaign of 1862, when George McClellan pushed to within a few miles of the city before Robert E. Lee drove him back in the 7 Days battles, and not in the Overland Campaign of 1864, when Grant fought his way south through the Wilderness, Spotsylvania, and Cold Harbor before settling into a siege at Petersburg 23 miles to the south. Richmond held. But holding was bleeding the city dry. There is a particular kind of misery that comes from being a city under siege, not the dramatic misery of bombardment, but the slow, grinding misery of a place where everything costs more every week, and the supply of everything shrinks. Hospitals overflowed with wounded. Refugees from the Virginia countryside crowded into already strained housing. The hotels still served meals, but the menus grew shorter and more creative in their substitutions. Coffee vanished, replaced by roasted grain or chicory. Butter gave way to lard. Shoes wore out and couldn't be replaced. The elite families held what they called starvation balls, dances where no food was served, only the pretense of normalcy. By the spring of 1863, the capital of the Confederacy could not feed itself. Inflation had turned Confederate currency into something approaching wallpaper. Prices had risen nearly tenfold compared to 1861 levels. The Union blockade had choked off imports. A brutal winter had buried the roads in snow and mud, cutting off what little food the surrounding countryside could still deliver. And then, on March 27th, Jefferson Davis issued a proclamation declaring a national day of fasting and prayer. In a city where working women were already going hungry, the Confederate president was asking them to skip a meal for God and country. On April 1st, 1863, a group of women, ordnance factory workers, wives of Tredegar Iron Works laborers, met at the Belvedere Hill Baptist Church in Richmond's Oregon Hill neighborhood. They were led by Mary Jackson, a peddler and mother of a Confederate soldier, and Minerva Meredith, whom Verena Davis later described as tall and daring. They resolved to gather the next morning at Capitol Square at the base of the equestrian statue of George Washington and demand a meeting with Virginia's governor, John Letcher, to address the food crisis. The next morning, April 2nd, 1863, several hundred women did exactly that. They marched to the governor's mansion. They were met, depending on whose account you trust, either with a refusal or with words so dismissive they amounted to the same thing. The crowd turned and surged down 9th Street, past Jefferson's Capitol, into the commercial district. They broke into warehouses and stores, seizing bacon, flour, sugar, shoes, clothing. The crowd swelled, some accounts say, to more than 1,000 people. They chanted what witnesses remembered as a single demand: bread or blood. Mayor Joseph Mayo arrived and literally read the riot act. He was ignored. Jefferson Davis reportedly appeared, climbed onto a wagon, emptied his pockets of whatever money he was carrying, and threatened to order troops to fire on the crowd if it did not disperse within 5 minutes. The crowd scattered. The city posted cannon on key streets for days afterward. More than 60 people were arrested. The Confederate War Department begged the Richmond newspapers not to report on the riot for fear of handing propaganda to the North. The papers mostly complied. But the story got out anyway. Union prisoners of war held in Richmond saw it happen and passed the word. The New York Times ran a front-page story 6 days later. Note the date, April 2nd. The bread riot was April 2nd, 1863. 2 years to the day before the telegram that ended everything. Through 1864 and into 65, the siege tightened. Grant didn't try another frontal assault on Richmond. Instead, from his trenches at Petersburg, he extended his lines westward, slowly, relentlessly, cutting the railroads that fed the city one by one. It was a war of logistics and attrition, and Richmond was losing. The warehouses were still full of tobacco. You couldn't eat it, and you couldn't ship it through a blockade, but it was worth a fortune on paper, and the Confederate government had no intention of handing it to the Union. Tredegar kept casting cannon, but coal and iron from the Shenandoah Valley were harder to get with each passing month, and Union cavalry raids had wrecked many of the upcountry forges that supplied raw material. The railroads still ran, but the rolling stock was falling apart, and replacement parts couldn't be manufactured fast enough. Richmond, in early 1865, was a city running on momentum alone. On Sunday morning, April 2nd, 1865, Jefferson Davis sat in his usual pew at St. Paul's Episcopal Church, 1 block east of Capitol Square. The Reverend Charles Minigerode was leading the service. The church was full. A messenger entered through a side door, walked down the aisle, and handed Davis a folded note. Davis read it, and those sitting nearby later said his expression changed in a way they had never seen. The note was from Robert E. Lee. Grant had broken through the Confederate lines at Petersburg that morning. Lee could no longer hold his position. Richmond must be evacuated. Davis stood, walked out of the church, and went directly to his office. Word spread, not by any official announcement, but by the sight of government clerks suddenly burning documents in the streets, by wagons appearing at the War Department, by the nervous energy of men walking too fast in the wrong direction. By afternoon, the Confederate government was in full retreat. Archives were loaded onto wagons. The Treasury, what was left of it, went onto a train. Hundreds of thousands of dollars in Confederate and state paper currency were destroyed, their value already more theoretical than real. Davis delayed his own departure, hoping for a reversal that wasn't coming, and finally boarded a train on the Richmond and Danville Railroad around 11 o'clock that night, nearly 3 hours behind schedule, heading southwest toward Danville. Behind him, Richmond began to come apart. Lieutenant General Richard S. Ewell, commanding the city's defenses, had orders to destroy anything of military value before the Union could take it. Deny the enemy the resources, burn the tobacco, destroy the ammunition, wreck the bridges. The logic was narrow and military, and taken on its own terms, perfectly rational. What Ewell either didn't anticipate or couldn't control was what would happen when you set fires in a commercial district packed with dry tobacco, wooden buildings, and barrels of whiskey in the small hours of a windy April morning with most of the fire department already gone. The first fires were set sometime after midnight on April 3rd at Shockoe Warehouse and other tobacco storage buildings along the waterfront. The tobacco caught immediately. Thousands of bales of dried leaf, pressed and stored and waiting for a market that had been blockaded for 4 years, burning faster than anyone expected. A southern wind rose with the dawn, pushing flames and embers northward from the river, building by building, block by block, up through the commercial district toward Capitol Square. The provost marshal's men had also been ordered to destroy liquor stocks to prevent looting, or at least that was the intention. Barrels of whiskey were smashed open and poured into the streets. The alcohol caught fire. Witnesses described blue flames running along the gutters like burning water. By 3 or 4 in the morning, the fire was beyond anyone's power to stop. The heat was so intense that Union soldiers arriving hours later reported their hair and beards were singed, their clothing smoking, when they tried to push through the streets near 14th. Residents in the path of the flames grabbed what they could: clothing, silverware, family papers, a portrait off the wall, and fled toward the one place that seemed safe, Capitol Square, Jefferson's open hilltop, where the stone Capitol and the surrounding trees offered something like shelter. Hundreds of people huddled there through the early morning hours, watching the city burn below them while embers drifted overhead. The streets beyond the square became a chaos of panicked civilians, retreating soldiers, and looters who had broken into the abandoned commissaries and discovered, to general fury, that the government warehouses were packed with food, smoked meats, flour, sugar, coffee. In a city that had been starving for 2 years, speculators had been hoarding. The mob took whatever wasn't already on fire and carried it off into the smoke. The arsenal near the river exploded, not once, but in a series of blasts that shattered windows 2 miles away and sent artillery shells arcing into the sky. The Gallego flour mills, the largest in the world, caught fire and burned. The newspaper offices of the Dispatch, the Enquirer, and the Examiner went up. The American and Columbian hotels burned. The Danville and Petersburg railroad depots burned. The Mayo Bridge over the James, the main crossing to the south side, was set ablaze by retreating troops. The Richmond and Petersburg Railroad Bridge went next. Banks, brokerage houses, law offices, restaurants, jewelers, barbers, confectioners. The Richmond Whig tried to compile a list of the losses afterward and couldn't do it accurately because in most places there wasn't even a sign left to identify what business had occupied a building. The work had to be done entirely from memory. And Jefferson's Capitol stood on the hill, watching. The fire burned right up to the edges of Capitol Square and stopped, partly because the open ground of the square acted as a fire break, partly because the stone and stucco of the building itself didn't catch, partly because a few passers-by managed to put out embers that landed on the roof. The Haxall-Crenshaw flour mills downstream also escaped by some combination of wind direction and luck. But from the steps of the Capitol, looking east and south toward the river, the view was apocalyptic. 20 blocks, 30 blocks. The historical marker that stands there now says 35, of the most productive commercial real estate in the South, gone in a single night. The Richmond Whig estimated at least 600 to 800 structures destroyed, and later assessments pushed that number past 800. The dollar figure, according to a retrospective published in the Richmond Times-Dispatch in 1904, was $8 to $10 million. Not a dollar of it recoverable in insurance. The Union Army entered Richmond on the morning of April 3rd. Troops under Major General Godfrey Weitzel, including regiments of United States colored troops, black soldiers marching into the capital of the slave-holding Confederacy, came in from the east. They found a city on fire, its population dazed, its streets full of smoke and looters. The first order of business was not occupation, it was firefighting. The Union soldiers organized bucket brigades, deployed the city's 2 surviving fire engines, pulled down threatened buildings to create fire breaks. By midday, with the wind finally calming, the worst of the fire was under control. The army that had tried to take Richmond for 4 years ended up saving what was left of it. The next day, April 4th, Abraham Lincoln came. He arrived by boat on the James River. City Point, his wartime command post, was only 20 miles downstream, and walked through the still smoking streets with a small escort and his young son, Tad. There was no motorcade, no security perimeter, no advance team, just the President of the United States walking through the ruined capital of the rebellion with a handful of sailors and officers. He visited the Confederate White House, Jefferson Davis's executive mansion, a handsome gray stucco building on Clay Street, and reportedly sat in Davis's chair. The symbolism required no explanation. Former slaves crowded around him in the streets, some weeping, some kneeling, and Lincoln is said to have told those who knelt to kneel only to God, that they were free and must stand as free people. He walked the ruins of a city that had been the object of his war for 4 years and found it destroyed not by his generals, but by the people who had sworn to defend it. 10 days later, Lee surrendered at Appomattox. 5 days after that, Lincoln was dead. Richmond after the fire was a study in what it means to lose everything at once. The commercial district, the part that generated the tax revenue, the employment, the banking and shipping and brokerage activity that made the rest of the city function, was simply gone. The tobacco industry would eventually rebuild, but the old firms, the old credit networks, the old relationships were scattered. Tredegar Iron Works survived the fire. It was far enough west along the canal to escape, but its Confederate contracts were worthless, and Joseph Anderson, who had served as a brigadier general for the Confederacy, had to petition for a presidential pardon before he could resume business. He got it. Tredegar continued operations for a few more decades, but it never regained what it had been. The physical rebuilding happened faster than the economic recovery. Within a couple of years, new commercial buildings were going up on the burned lots, brick this time, not wood, as though the lesson of the fire was architectural rather than political. But structures are not an economy. The labor system that had powered Richmond's antebellum industries, enslaved workers hired out to factories, mills, and docks, was gone, and the transition to free labor was wrenching and uneven. The capital that had fueled pre-war commerce, tied up in Confederate bonds now worth nothing, in the appraised value of enslaved people now legally free, in inventory that had literally gone up in smoke, had to be reconstructed from almost nothing. Banks had no deposits. Merchants had no stock. Commission agents had no one to represent. The relationships that make a commercial district function, the handshake deals, the lines of credit extended on trust, the institutional memory of who owed whom and for what, had burned with the paper they were written on. The railroads came back fastest because railroads were strategic assets that both the federal government and the Reconstruction authorities needed. Richmond remained a junction, and that underlying geographic advantage, the fall line, the river, the convergence of routes, hadn't changed. The city was still in the right place. It just had to figure out again what to build there. What saved Richmond, or at least gave it a second identity, was the same commodity that had destroyed it, tobacco. Lewis Ginter had arrived in Richmond from New York in 1842, an 18-year-old kid who opened a shop selling toys and notions. By the 1850s, he'd built a successful wholesale linen business. He served as a commissary major for the Confederacy during the war, and when he returned to Richmond after Appomattox, he found the city in ruins. His own warehouse stores of tobacco and sugar had been destroyed in the evacuation fire. He sold what cotton he had left, went back to New York, tried banking, lost everything in the financial panic of 1869, and came back to Richmond again in 1872, broke, 50 years old, and looking for a third fortune. He found it in cigarettes. Partnering with a Richmond tobacconist named John F. Allen, Ginter formed Allen and Ginter, which started with 20 young women hand-rolling cigarettes in a small factory. But Ginter was a marketer as well as a manufacturer. He branded his cigarettes Richmond Gems, Richmond Straight Cuts, Virginia Brights, and introduced innovations that now seem obvious but were novel then. Collectible picture cards tucked into the packs, branded packaging, international distribution. By 1888, Allen and Ginter employed over 1,000 workers and was producing 2 million cigarettes a day, with offices in London, Paris, and Berlin. In 1890, the firm merged with James Buchanan Duke's operation to form the American Tobacco Company. Richmond was, again, the cigarette capital of America. Ginter poured his tobacco fortune back into the city. He developed streetcar suburbs, Ginter Park, Sherwood Park, with paved roads, sewer lines, and artesian wells, at a time when Richmond's streets were still half mud. He commissioned Carrere and Hastings, one of the most prestigious architecture firms in the country, to design the Jefferson Hotel, which opened in 1895 and was immediately regarded as one of the finest hotels in the United States. The centerpiece of its lobby was a life-size marble statue of Thomas Jefferson, sculpted by Edward Valentine. A monument to the man who had designed the Capitol, standing in a hotel built by a man whose tobacco stores had burned in the fire that nearly took the Capitol down. Ginter never spelled out the irony. He didn't need to. Monument Avenue was laid out in the 1890s, a grand residential boulevard lined with statues of Confederate leaders, Lee, Stuart, Jackson, Davis. For 130 years, it was one of the most famous streets in the South, a kind of outdoor cathedral to the lost cause narrative. The statues came down in 2020 and 2021. What remains is the boulevard itself, wide, tree-lined, handsome, flanked by houses built by people who had money in the early 20th century and who chose to live on a street defined by monuments to a war their city lost. The Tredegar Iron Works buildings still stand along the James River Canal. They house the American Civil War Museum now. The Gallego Mills are an archaeological ruin, fragments of foundation walls visible near the canal, interpreted by a few signs and the imaginations of whoever stops to look. The Spotswood Hotel is gone. The Exchange Hotel is gone. Shockoe Bottom, the low-lying district where the warehouses stood and the slave traders did their business and the fire started, is partly gentrified apartments, partly parking lots, partly an ongoing argument about what you do with a place whose history is so layered and so painful that every proposal to develop it runs into the question of what's underneath. The evacuation fire remains one of the strangest events in American urban history. Not a natural disaster, not an act of war exactly, the enemy didn't do it, a deliberate act of denial that accomplished almost nothing of military value. The tobacco that burned couldn't have been shipped through a blockade anyway. The bridges that were wrecked were rebuilt within weeks. The arsenal's ammunition would have been captured, yes, but the loss of an entire commercial district, the banks that held the deposits, the records that documented the debts, the businesses that employed thousands, was a wound out of all proportion to whatever tactical benefit the fires might have provided. Ewell followed orders. The orders made a kind of narrow sense. But the result was that the Confederacy's last act in its own capital was to destroy it, as if 4 years of war hadn't been punishment enough for the crime of being indispensable. Jefferson's capital still stands on the hill, a white temple overlooking the river where the falls still drop, where the rapids still churn, where the water still does what it has always done, run east toward the bay, indifferent to what anyone builds beside it. The building has been expanded and renovated over the centuries, but the original structure is still there, the Maison Café of the New World, the first neoclassical public building in America. It housed a democratic legislature. It housed a rebel Congress. It survived a fire set by the government it sheltered. It kept standing when everything around it burned. A city builds itself over 128 years, warehouse by warehouse, mill by mill, rail line by rail line. Then, one night in April, on orders from its own generals, it lights a match and watches a century of work disappear into the sky. What's left is the river, the fall line, the hard rock underneath the rapids, the geography that brought everyone here in the first place. The water keeps dropping over the rocks, the same way it did when Byrd stood on the bluff and thought of England.